All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.
Welcome back to part 2 of what we've called Rise of the Nazi Cult, and we have with us the expert on both occultism and Nazism, Peter Levenda. And I just want to say, Peter, before we continue, that the name that escaped us was Marta Council?
Yes, that's her.
Yeah.
Yes.
I looked it up in the break.
Marta Council, yes, exactly.
We've been covering a lot of names. I guess many of these are strange names to most of the listeners, but it's easier if we go into more of what they did. Now, for instance, you mentioned some things in part 1 here that you could explain a little. Let's start with the Spear of Destiny. What was all that fuss about?
As it happened a couple of years ago, I was interviewed in a documentary on this very subject for Brad Meltzer. He has a series on the History Channel, I think it was, called Brad Meltzer Decoded, I think. And I did about a half an hour of that program concerning this very subject because it's something that fascinates a lot of people. There is no question that Hitler was not fascinated by the so-called Spear of Destiny. He grew up in Austria, and the so-called spear was in the museum in Vienna. So he saw the spear as a young man, and he saw it again when, after Anschluss and Germany acquired Austria, invaded it, basically immediately those treasures from the museum in Vienna were taken out of Vienna and taken to Nuremberg. What is the Spear of Destiny? Supposedly the Spear of Destiny is the spear that pierced the side of Jesus on the cross. According to the Gospels, as Jesus is on the cross, there's a Roman soldier. His name is not mentioned in the Gospels. We get this as a tradition later. His name is Longinus, and he takes the spear and he stabs Jesus in order to kill him, put him out of his misery, basically. And that spear then becomes a sacred symbol. If you are familiar with the Eastern Orthodox Church, for instance, they perform the Mass, what they call the Divine Liturgy, in the original form, and they use a golden spear. It's a very small golden knife in order to reenact this moment of piercing the side of Christ. They pierce a loaf of bread, and at that moment, one of the altar boys, one of the other priests, pours water and wine into a chalice to symbolize the blood and water that issued forth from Jesus' body. So there's a lot of mystique around this idea of the spear. It was believed that the spear was discovered possibly around the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era in the Middle East and was brought back to Europe after the time of Constantine. And this spear was then a kind of holy relic that was used as a source of power, an instrument of power. Whoever had it had access to a kind of an occult energy, let's say, that's in the spear. Well, there's photographs of Hitler after Anschluss in Vienna, standing outside the glass box that holds the spear and staring at it. And then shortly after that, that spear and all the crown jewels of the Habsburg dynasty, they're all removed from Vienna and they wind up in Nuremberg. Himmler, the head of the SS, actually had a replica made of the spear, an exact replica that he kept on his desk.
Why didn't he just take the spear? He had the power to.
Well, this was kept, I believe, in a vault in Nuremberg. Nuremberg, you see, was considered a sacred city to the Germans. Nuremberg was kind of a holy place, a kind of Jerusalem. So it was believed that these implements should be kept in that location. Himmler had control of all of that anyway. So he didn't really need to have the spear itself on his desk. And anyway, it's possible somebody would have stolen it, even from Himmler. So he had an exact replica, a perfect replica made. There's a photograph in a book published a few years ago which shows that spear sitting on Himmler's desk. So we have this idea that this was extremely important to the Nazis. And then there's some mystery about what happened after the war. Because after the war, did the real spear become repatriated and wind up back in Austria? or was the spear in Austria the artifact that Himmler had made, the replica? And did the real spear escape? And this has been part of the story, part of the mythology about the Spear of Destiny. Did it find its way onto a submarine? Was it taken to South America or to Antarctica, or one of these stories where it's waiting for the new, Aryan Messiah to come and to brandish it and to declare his new world order? I mean, who knows? But tests have not been conclusive on the spear that is in Vienna.
Interesting.
We know that some of the materials used on the spear are old, but they're not old enough to have been 2,000 years old. But the actual spear itself, the actual material of the spear, I do not believe has been tested. What's been tested is the bindings of the spear, because it's been wrapped, and there are nails involved and everything else. But the actual spear itself, the point of the spear, I believe has not been carbon dated or tested in any way yet.
No, but the original spear that was in Germany could have been a falsification anyway.
Sure.
I think this Ravenscroft you mentioned in part 1, didn't he conclude that the CIA took it and that's why America became a new world power?
That's why I really don't use Ravenscroft as a source. I find that really, the truth is much stranger than fiction. Yeah. And if you really concentrate on the truth, you'll find some very amazing things. But me thinking the CIA has a Spear of Destiny, I think they wish they did maybe at this point. It might be useful, but I don't believe it, no. I'm not even 100% sure that the spear, was replaced, by the Nazis, that somehow the fake spear is in Vienna. I'm not 100% convinced of that either. I think that probably is what the Habsburgs had in the museum. I think that's the spear. But if that's so, then what happened to the replica? We don't know. We've never found Himmler's replica, and that was a very important object for Himmler. So what happened to it? Where did it go? We simply don't know. But then a lot of things were stolen by the Nazis at that time, which have never been found. And there's a whole documentation on that. There's gold, there's valuables, artworks, manuscripts, things that have disappeared forever. That we've never found. So it may be an Indiana Jones story. There may be the spear sitting in a warehouse somewhere in Washington D.C. We just don't
exactly. Okay, we'll cover a couple of more fancy stuff before we get back down to earth again. What about the expeditions to Tibet?
Well, I find that to be one of the most fascinating stories, because I was not aware they actually took place until I stumbled upon the documents in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I had gone there in the 1970s to
Tibet?
No, to the National Archives,
not
to Tibet.
No, okay.
I had gone to the National Archives in order to look at the captured German records. I was working on the book that would eventually become Unholy Alliance, and I was, doing some research there, and the archivist there recognized, what I was looking for, and he said, "Well, take a look at these microfilms." And it turned out to be the microfilms of the Ahnenerbe SS,
wow.
Which, in those days we had Trevor Ravenscroft, we had a few other authors like Powles and Bergier, The Morning of the Magicians, books like that were very speculative on the idea of Nazi occultism. And then suddenly I'm staring at the Nazi documents themselves, which not only verify the fact that the Nazis were interested in occultism, but amplified on that considerably. And one of the things that I discovered was this fascinating expedition to Tibet. What was an SS expedition in 1938, remember? Yeah. This was the time when the war was just about to break out. It broke out in September 39, but in 1938 there was already Anschluss, there was already a tremendous upheaval in Europe, and yet Himmler decides he's going to send an expedition to Tibet, of all places. And they go. The expedition goes to Tibet. Photographs of it are reproduced in Unholy Alliance. You'll see swastika flags. They were not covering, who they were, what they were doing. These were SS men. These were SS officers, all of them. And their idea was they were going to collect as much information about Tibet as possible. But for what purpose? There were multiple purposes. One purpose, of course, was political. Could they build an alliance with Tibet against British India in the event that war broke out between Germany and England? Would Tibet side with them? That was one potential policy they wanted to discuss. Something else they wanted to find out, were the Tibetans Aryans? Did the Aryan race come from Tibet?
Yeah, they were looking for their ancestors, so to speak.
They were looking for their ancestors. So Bruno Beger, the man that I mentioned, who was a war criminal, there are photographs of him very gleefully measuring the skulls of Tibetans with calipers. When I'm saying the skulls of living Tibetans with calipers, trying to figure out, through measurements, this sort of phony ethnography they were doing to see if the measurements would match up with Aryan measurements, if these were really Aryans in disguise, So that was going on. They observed a lot of social customs, which they wrote about extensively. They took flora and fauna back with them, plants, animals, all sorts of things back with them. There was also the...
Excuse me, I heard they also took back with them a small Tibetan army? Have you heard anything about that?
Well, sure. That's been reported, I think, again, in Trevor Ravenscroft. I don't think it was a Tibetan army they took back with them. They had Sherpas, of course, that were guiding them, through into the passes and then back out again. I think that some Tibetan personnel did wind up in Berlin. There have been reports persistent that there were Tibetan monks in Berlin when war was over.
Dressed in SS uniforms.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, please continue. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but that's exactly. And plus, they also brought back, of course, the Tibetan scriptures. I spoke briefly when I was writing on Holy Alliance with Dr. Robert Thurman, of course, the famous Tibetan scholar, when he was at, I think he may still be at Columbia University. And I had gone to Tibet House in New York. I had seen the film footage of the Tibet expedition, which nobody knew really was there. I saw the film footage of an OSS expedition, American intelligence, following like maybe a year later, going to Tibet as well. This is a tremendous story was waiting here to be told.
Yeah.
And I called Robert Thurman and I said, there's a record the Nazis brought back, a 108-volume text from Tibet. Do you have any idea what that was? He got very irritated that I brought this up. Of course, he's a friend of the Dalai Lama, and he's a Tibetan expert, and he's the father, of course, of Uma Thurman, for those who are wondering. And he said it's probably the Kangjur, which is the Tibetan scripture. It's sort of their version of the Buddhist canons. And he said that's probably what it was, and then he hung up. So I didn't get much more out of him after that. I wanted to talk about Tibetans in Berlin and all the rest of it, but he wasn't. Yeah. He was not having any.
No.
So that didn't happen. But so there was this expedition. They came back, and then they went all through Germany with a kind of pictorial film presentation of, Secret Tibet. I believe it was called Geheimnis Tibet, if I'm not mistaken. And they had, photographs, pictures. They showed, they were glorifying in the fact they had been to Tibet and what a strange place, what an exotic place. And they sort of, dined out on this story for quite some time. There's photographs of Himmler with Ernst Schaefer, who was the leader of the expedition, with Bruno Beger and the others. Himmler was very proud of this expedition. And there's a possibility there was another experiment that was conducted in Tibet, which goes back to our hollow earth theory. The idea being that maybe Tibet, being the highest point in the world on top of the Himalayas, would have been an excellent place to test this hollow earth theory. So there was that, and a kind of a world ice theory thing.
Yeah, if we are inside the earth, it would be. But if we are outside the earth, it would be the worst kind of place.
The worst place, exactly.
Even though they do have myths of Shamballah and Agharta and all that.
Sure. So this is another thing that they were supposed to do. They were supposed to conduct these scientific experiments up there as well. So all of this was part of that Tibet expedition. Nothing to do directly with Heinrich Harrer, the guy of 7 Years of Tibet, that they made the movie about. Not a direct connection. But as I point out in the Hitler Legacy, we now know that Heinrich Harrer was not only an SS officer, he was an officer in the SA as well, the Sturmabteilung, which was the stormtroopers. So he was a dedicated Nazi, an Austrian, in the days when the Nazi Party was outlawed in Austria before Anschluss. This was a very dedicated Nazi. He worked for intelligence services, I believe because he was in Tibet at the time the Dalai Lama had to escape, that he was also involved with the CIA, which was trying to arrange for the Dalai Lama to escape. There were a lot of high-level discussions going on while Harrer was in the country.
Wait a minute. Are you now talking after the war? Because CIA wasn't in existence before the war.
No, Harrer was there after the war.
Right.
Harrer got into Tibet right around 1945.
Ah, okay.
He was a prisoner of war in northern India. He escaped a couple of times. The last time with his friend Peter Aufschnagel, they managed to cross the mountains into Tibet. And so they were there for 7 years, roughly 45 to 52. So yes, he was there when the escape was taking place of the Dalai Lama, and the CIA was founded, as you know, in 1947. So we were in discussions with the Dalai Lama in the 1940s, late 1940s, as to what he should do. Will we give him guns? Will we give him, will we defend Tibet against the Chinese, so on and so forth? Harrer was part of those discussions. Harrer was there. And there is now a strong amount of evidence to suggest that Harrer was working for American intelligence at the time, but he might have been working for other intelligence agencies as well, which would have included Reinhard Gehlen's. The reason is, for the same reason the Nazis hated communists in Europe, they also hated communists in Asia.
Right.
And Harrer was in the excellent position to provide intelligence on communism in Asia. And he went back to Asia a number of times after Tibet. And those trips were always very suspicious.
But before the end of the war, was he then not an expedition man? He was stationed in Germany?
He came to fame because he climbed I believe it was the north face of the Eiger. So he was one of the first people to do that. He has his picture taken with Adolf Hitler and his climbing party for that reason. So he was given so many awards. He was a cherished mountaineer for the Nazis, and he did not participate in the war itself. He stayed behind. And then there's this strange story of Harrer going to India. He's going to start climbing mountains for some sort of scientific purpose, which makes no sense at all because the war was already right underway. He was in British-occupied India at the time. The whole thing smacks of an intelligence operation. We think he was lying through his teeth about why he was captured and what he was up to. And then he escapes into Tibet, and the rest is history.
I see. You did mention that Himmler was fond of issuing expeditions, sitting safe and sound in his German office and getting reports. Yep. And you mentioned looking for the Grail, retrieving the old Qatars places. But one thing that's always fascinated me, and actually we'll have programs on this topic in the future, but you could probably also contribute to this, and that is the weird obsession they had with the Poles. I remember one of the first books I read about it was Professor Jocelyn Goodwin's Arctos.
Yes.
What's your take on this? Antarctica and Arctis.
Yeah, it is an obsession, and it stems exactly from the belief that Thule Gesellschaft. The Thule is supposedly a kingdom in the ice in one of the poles, probably in the North Pole. I mean, there is a city, I believe, in Greenland called Ultima Thule.
Yeah.
So this is part of this mystique that there is a place which was a kind of Shangri-La or Shambhala below the earth at the poles that their race came from. That if you could go there, you would find, cities underground and all the rest of it, part of the hollow earth theory. And you could only access them, obviously, through the poles because they're so inaccessible to humans anyway. It makes the perfect hiding place for a secret civilization. And we know, for instance, that the Germans sent an expedition to the South Pole, to Antarctica, just before the war started. I think it was in 1938, if I'm not mistaken. They sent an Antarctic expedition, it might have been earlier, in order to find out what was going on down there. They planted swastika flags everywhere. They claimed Antarctica for the Third Reich.
Yes, and they did this on Norwegian territory with complete disregard for international law.
Of course. Why would they stop? Why would they start now?
Yeah. Well, this was before the invasion of Poland.
Yeah.
So you could argue this was the first actual invasion of any other country.
Yes, you could make that case. Yeah, the invasion of Antarctica.
It just dawned upon me. They actually invaded Norway first.
Yeah, there you go.
Queen Maud's land. But continue.
Yes, Queen Maud's land, exactly.
Yeah. Which they called New Swabia?
Neue Schwabenland. Yeah. So they called it Neue Schwabenland. And what is interesting about it is that the man who was in charge of that expedition, whose name I forget, but I believe it's in my book, Hitler Legacy, if I'm not mistaken, the man who was in charge of that expedition actually survived the war and became kind of part of the Nazi underground. Although he was a scientist, he was involved in meteorology and those kinds of studies. He, for some reason, maintained contact with a lot of the old comrades after the war, a lot of whom had been scientists. We brought some over from Paperclip, for instance, of course, as everyone knows. He was not one of them, but he did survive the war. And then a funny thing happens. I think everyone who's listening to this may already be aware. that directly after the end of the war, in a time of tremendous upheaval, economic collapse all over the place, everything is in chaos, the United States decides to send an expedition of their own to Antarctica, and it's known as Operation High Jump. At a tremendous expense, we send an enormous flotilla, a convoy of ships, thousands of men, all sorts of materiel, goes down to Antarctica supposedly to conduct scientific experiments. Like we needed to do this immediately. You know, we had just defeated Germany.
With bombers. And,
yes, with bombers.
All kinds of weapons. Yeah.
What was the point of that? You know, we still don't know exactly because the reasons we're given are all very vague and ambiguous and don't make any sense. And the fact is they really didn't take any scientific instrumentation with them. So,
and it's still classified, isn't it?
It's still classified, sure.
So you were saying that they may have established bases there then already in 1938?
Well, it seems as though they did something there. It was the International Geophysical Year. Okay, that was the sensible occasion for the Nazis to go to Antarctica.
Alfred Richter? Could that be him?
Yeah, I think it might have been Richter, yes.
Okay.
I think so.
Yeah.
So this was their ostensible reason for going down there, the International Geophysical Year. But we had no reason to go during Operation High Jump. There was no particular reason for us to be down there, especially as the war in Japan had just ended. We were still involved with the occupation. We were still involved with, Japanese soldiers not knowing the war was over, still fighting. And yet for some reason we find it's convenient to send an entire navy down to Antarctica. One of the people who was on Operation High Jump, who participated in that event, was a man that I talk about in the Hitler Legacy, who had been a member of the German Secret Service before the war. During the war, for some reason, they allowed him into the U.S. Navy. And then after the war, he goes back into basically running the American branch of the German underground of Odessa. A very interesting guy, kind of a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi, and that you would not really expect to find anywhere. A very prominent human being in the underground.
But still, he worked for the Americans during the war?
Yeah. I think they didn't realize that he was a card-carrying member of the Sicherheitsdienst, of the SD, of the Secret Service. So there's something very strange about that story that I've not been able to understand. And I'm still trying to figure that out because there are elements of it that are very mysterious. This man, who knew a lot of people that I knew when I was doing the research for this book back in the 70s and the 80s, when I was doing that, we had
For Unholy Alliance.
For Unholy Alliance, yeah. In those days, I knew a lot of people that we called neo-Nazis, who actually, in my way of thinking, were just Nazis in the American Nazi movement. He was part of that background. His name was H. Keith Thompson, and he seemed to be independently wealthy. That's kind of mysterious where his money came from. But he was very involved with Hans Ulrich Rudel, with Otto Skorzeny, with Savitri Devi. As you mentioned, all of these people were part of his circle of friends and acquaintances. He was very involved with the Liberty Lobby in the United States, which is an extreme right conservative group. Very extreme right, let's put it that way.
Yeah, they often disguise themselves with the words liberty. So yeah,
absolutely, sure. And they were the ones who financed SS General Otto Rehmer to come to the United States to give a speech, in favor of the Republican Party, And attending that speech was Pat Buchanan, a very famous American politician and ideologue. Thompson is behind a lot of very strange material, but what your listeners may find astonishing and may refuse to believe it, although I give the evidence, is that H. Keith Thompson was not only a Nazi, was not only a member of the German secret police, secret service. Not only did he constantly say that he had taken an oath to the Fuhrer, to Adolf Hitler, and he was faithful to that oath to the rest of his life, but he was also the literary agent for Marguerite Oswald, the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald. He was the person representing her to publishing houses to get her a publishing contract.
Right. Wow, that's classical Levenda connections right there, people.
Wow. Yeah, it is. It was astonishing when I saw it because if we look at Lee Harvey Oswald's address book, that was taken when he was arrested for the assassination. We find a lot of German vocabulary. He was teaching himself German for some reason. And he also had the address of the American Nazi Party in his address book. We don't know.
And the leader, what was his name? Rock something?
George Lincoln Rockwell. But Rockwell had been assassinated. I think by this time he was talking to someone, or he had known about someone called Dan Burroughs. Dan Burroughs was running the American Nazi Party out of an apartment in Queens, New York. And he was working with a man called Roy Frankhauser, who was a Ku Klux Klan official of some kind.
In New York?
Well, the Ku Klux Klan base was in Pennsylvania, which doesn't make any sense either, okay. I know. The largest Klan operation in the country was in New Jersey, which people don't really realize. But Frankhauser was in Pennsylvania. I met Frankhauser, not realizing that he was the man who knew Dan Burroughs. Dan Burroughs committed suicide in Roy Frankhauser's house when it was revealed that Dan Burroughs was a Jew. Wow. So there's all kinds of stories.
That does smell, though, of murder, but I don't know. It's just speculation.
Yeah. I mean, Frankhauser was known for a lot of violence. Frankhauser, when I met him, pointed a Luger at me as if to say, "Don't pull any funny stuff or I'll shoot you." And I was just there to interview him. And he had pictures of the Klan, photographs of Klansmen burning crosses, right. The whole thing. Very involved with the neo-Nazi party organizations in the States. Very involved with the Nazi underground as well.
Yeah. You know what? I look so forward to have a show with you on the post-war.
The post-war is
because that needs its own show. It is. Yeah. But could we just go a little back to Antarctica? Sure. And you mentioned this Richter or something. Because if what you're saying is real, then he must be very important also for the post-war basis.
He survived, like I say, the war. I know this because I was in a privileged position to see an address book of a Nazi who died in Asia. And this, his name, his address, everything appears in this address book. And at that time, I believe he was living in South America. So he was one of the ones who, for some reason, found it necessary to escape.
But why would they go to Antarctica in the first place? What was their obsession with the poles? Was it just practical to have bases, or does this fit in with their philosophy somehow?
No, I believe it's their philosophy. One of the philosophies that they promoted highly in those days as a real scientific theory was the world ice theory, as they called it, invented by a man called Hans Horberger. The world ice theory said that the world goes through these periods of getting very cold, and there's ice ages and all the rest of it. But there's this idea that in Antarctica or in the poles in general, there is archaeological evidence of earlier civilizations. So this was part of the idea that the Nazis had. Remember, they were very interested in finding evidence of an Aryan civilization that was global.
Excuse me, was the Piri Rice map generally known at this point?
I don't know if it was known. I mean, I have a book almost within arm's reach, but I don't know if it was really known to the Nazis at that time, the Piri Rice map. That might have come. That sounds like a 1930s discovery, though, doesn't it? I mean, I'm trying to.
Yeah, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, but it would make sense to look for an antediluvian civilization in the South Pole, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would. And if people who believed the Hollow Earth stories, would have taken it for granted that there was an entranceway somewhere down there. Also, there was the idea constantly the Nazis had, Himmler had, and his people that, you could spy on the rest of the world from different parts of the world if, we truly live inside a hollow earth. All of these scientific theories got mixed up together. But I think that there was a belief as well among the Americans that certain high-ranking Nazi personnel, technology, weaponry made its way to Antarctica after the war by U-boat. And this was something that a lot of people took for granted. They believed this was possible. We know that U-boats were as far south as Argentina, Rio de la Plata, down South America towards Patagonia. And it's only a relatively short sail from the southern tip of South America to the northern tip of Antarctica. So there might have been a belief that somehow the Nazis, during that International Geophysical Year, that they had established a base in Neue Schwabenland, as they called it, and that they had, they planted Nazi flags. We know that all over the place. They dropped them from airplanes and that sort of thing, claiming the land. And it's possible that people believed there was a Nazi base down there, that somehow the Nazis had found a way to build, a year-round a bunker in that part of the world as well. So we just don't know. We don't have the documents for high jump. Our expedition is a mystery. I still find it unbelievable that we would have done this at that point in time. And the Nazi, there's a persistent rumor about Nazis. And one of the persistent rumors, by the way, about Antarctica and the poles in general was promoted by a man called Ernst Zundel, who ran a publishing house in Canada, which was very revisionist. The Holocaust didn't happen, so on and so forth. He was arrested, actually, in Canada for doing that. But he published books insisting that there was a UFO base in that part of the world. And there was a Nazi UFO Antarctica connection, a connection between the Nazis and UFOs based in Antarctica. And the funny thing is, if you know Linda Moulton Howe, UFO researcher, a very famous researcher, had actually interviewed a man who worked for the Americans, I guess from the American Navy, had done overflights of Antarctica much later than Operation High Jump, but his reports seemed to indicate that there was a base down there of some kind, that there was something going on down there. It was weaponry that was being stored down there of some kind. There was some experiments taking place there, or there was an alien presence, something of that nature, which we had sent scientists down to Antarctica. They returned from their visit to the specific site, very deep in the continent, came back terrified, were debriefed, then scattered around the world so they couldn't tell their story to anyone. So this is one of the stories that Linda Moulton Howe's come up with, and she's generally pretty reliable when it comes to this type of information. So I'm interested to find out more about that. There could be a connection there which we can't even begin to speculate, that it has to do with off-world, matters and, Nazi UFO, research and that sort of thing.
This is a good point to pitch a future show. We'll have, like I mentioned briefly, we'll have an entire show on the Antarctica Nazi connection. And Peter has now already mentioned some of it. So you can look forward to that, people. It's an incredibly interesting topic. And I just see here that up until 1938, there was 1939 actually was the last, 3 German Antarctic expeditions, and at least the third one was so big that they could establish bases based on that. And obviously we know from later history that UFO sightings have been associated to the poles. There's been alleged crashes even up here on the north in Spitsbergen. And it's just it won't die, this modern myth about UFOs, Nazis and the poles. There's something there to be retrieved for sure. I think we should get a little down to earth now, because you mentioned reality is more interesting than fiction, and there is some very interesting aspects we haven't touched so much up on. I want to begin with, you mentioned briefly the American connection, Ford. What about Bush?
Yeah, I once made a presentation at a university down here in the United States in Florida. When I was discussing this, and a professor stopped me in the middle of it because he was certain I had no proof of what I was talking about. I don't know if you know Florida very well, but southern Florida in particular is, let's say, put it this way, there's a very strong Republican presence down here.
Axial Cuban people?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So you have this kind of idea that you shouldn't say anything bad about Republicans. And here I was saying that the Bushes were involved with the Nazis, which is exactly what they did not want to hear. But I had the documentation in my presentation, so I could show, court documents, and I could show newspaper articles and all the rest of it. When we're talking about the Bush family, we have to go back to Prescott Bush. We have to go back to Averell Harriman, for instance, and some of the other people that were very closely related, both biologically and in business, with the Bushes. So we're talking about a dynasty of families that goes back. They're extremely blue blood Americans from that point of view. They represent a distinct class within American society. We're supposed to have no classes in our country, but of course we do. Very much so. And anyone who has crossed paths with the blue-blooded Americans knows that they are definitely considered to be an inferior race compared to them. We just don't live in the same world at all. We don't have the same expectations.
Yeah, the so-called two Americas that we hear so much about.
Absolutely. There's at least two, if not more. And this 1%, as we say at the top, lives in a completely different world. They live in a bubble of their own. And the Bushes are no exception to this. They probably represent it as clearly as anyone. In fact, we mentioned Nixon earlier. Nixon would have been considered really second rate as far as his pedigree is concerned. The Bushes, of course, go back a long time. They're Yale University, lineage. They're heritage members of the Skull and Bones Society and all the rest of it. They go back, to the hardcore, came off the Mayflower kind of Americans. So they were very prominent supporters of the Nazis. I have to say it, since the 1930s at least, if not earlier, and really into the war. Their business operations had to be shut down by the U.S. government under the Trading with the Enemies Act because they were still dealing with Nazi Germany after we had declared war on them. To the Bush family, business is business. There's no ideology involved, ostensibly. Of course, they wouldn't really go into business with communists, but they would go into business with the Nazis because they felt the Nazis were a great bulwark against communism. They were the ones who were going to protect the world from, the sort of rabid mongrel races that were overtaking the planet due to Bolshevism and communism. So the Bushes were dead set against anything to do with communism, and they were very sympathetic towards the goals of the Nazis. Eugenics was a major issue for them as well. It was actually the Bush family that ensured that German scientists would be able to attend a meeting in New York City on eugenics. I believe that was also in 1938, and paid for their passage on the Hamburg-America line, which they owned a controlling share of. So we had Nazi scientists coming to the United States to talk about, how to deal with, subhuman races. And all the rest of it. So the Bushes were very front and center with this type of operation. Of course, their business dealings across the board in Nazi Germany, we don't really know. I think the average person doesn't understand the extent to which American business was in bed with Nazi industrialists and Nazi bankers before, during, and after the war. This was something that business knows no ideology. In this case, business knows no nationalism either.
Yeah, Joseph Farrell mentioned in a show we just had with him that the leader of the bank in Switzerland was an American.
Yes. I talk about him at some length in Hitler Legacy. We're talking about a man who was put in charge of the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland. Now, the Bank of International Settlements was set up by Hjalmar Schacht, who was Hitler's banker. He was the man who performed the economic miracle and turned Nazi Germany, into this economic machine and this military machine. Schacht was responsible for that. He created this Bank of International Settlements in order to repay Germany's war debt from World War I, ostensibly. Of course, that never happened. The bank never paid any German war debts at all. No. What happened instead was Germany used it as a slush fund and to launder money. And to hide the gold that they had seized from other banks from other countries and pushed it into that bank. And we have, our American, guy sitting there very, happy, running this banking operation. And as late as, what was it, maybe 1943, I think, if not 44, he was back in the United States telling financiers on Wall Street not to worry about investments in Germany. Everything was going fine. Hitler had everything under control.
So, and this was as late as 43. Well, that was when the war turned.
Well, the war really turned in 44 with the invasion, right, with the D-Day invasion.
Yeah, I was thinking about Stalingrad and
Sure.
smelling, the wind. But,
Yeah.
but officially, yeah.
Yeah, in 43, sure, the writing was on the wall. But in 44, we knew it was over.
Yeah.
In 44, it was obvious it was over. But in 43, he still felt that that's why he went to New York. He went to New York to calm everybody down. Don't worry about it. Hitler has everything under control.
Right.
That's the kind of mentality that we're dealing with. It's a mentality that's totally divorced from what's going on in the real world. It's the world of business, which exists for itself. Now, at the same time that he's doing this at the Bank of International Settlements, you have Henry Morgenthau in the United States working for Franklin Roosevelt, Secretary of the Treasury, who's trying to insist that this banking operation be closed down. He wants to make sure that after the end of the war, Germany is flattened, that there's no possible way for Germany to rearm itself or to have any industrial capacity whatsoever, right? But Henry Morgenthau is Jewish. And so the right wing in the United States starts a whisper campaign against him, trying to influence Roosevelt in the other direction, saying, well, Henry Morgenthau is just a Jew. He wants revenge for whatever happened in the Holocaust, which we don't really know because we can't see it. We don't know what's going on. And so you had this battle of wills between the pro-Nazi camp in the United States and the anti-Nazi camp, which extended right through the war. And it involved people like the Bushes. It involved Sullivan Cromwell, which is Alan Dulles' law firm. Alan Dulles later became head of CIA, but at that time he was in Switzerland.
As did Bush.
Father
of W.
Exactly, yeah, father of W. Yeah. So yeah, we're talking about a very small group of people. It's an incestuous little circle of people who run things, and it's a gentleman's club. It's an old boys club. And if you're not wearing the right tie, you don't belong to the club. And you don't have, any influence on what's taking place or what's going on.
But isn't there Jews also in the banker class? How did they handle this?
Well, yes and no. People bring this up to me quite often. And they say, well, the Jews own all the banks. And I'll say, maybe Jews own banks, but they don't own the money that's in the banks. And that's the difference. The old money is what calls the shots. So they can easily move their money from one bank to another without anybody being able to stop them. So I've always felt that this idea of the Jewish banking thing, yes, it's true. There's a lot of Jewish people involved in banking. They pretty much had to be. They were sort of kept out of other industries in Europe because of all the regulations. So yeah, of course, that's true. We have to accept the fact that there are Jewish bankers in the world. But Jewish bankers were not there helping to support the Nazis. We had very specific banks, the Bank of International Settlements, of course, being the primary example. But we also had German banks with offices and branches all over the world that were moving money backwards and forwards. And there was the First National Bank and the National Bank, the Federal Reserve vaults in New York City, which were holding Nazi gold reserves. And did so long after the war.
But did the Nazis manage to transfer some of the loot and plunder already before the war or before the end of the war?
Oh, certainly. Absolutely. We have the records. We have the documentation on this. That's not a mystery.
Yeah, I know some of these Bormann and stuff, they had this escape plan from 43, 44. But
sure.
Even before it turned, they transferred the values.
Well, what they were doing is they were building foreign bases. They were building industrial and economic bases in other countries to help support the war effort. I think it's not really well known, for instance, that Mexico during the late 1930s was very pro-Nazi because they were very anti-American. The gringos to the north were the enemy. The Norteamericanos were the ones who were the oppressors of Mexico. So from their point of view, they sided with the Nazis. So many anti-colonial powers sided with Hitler and the Nazis.
Yeah, and Argentina was famous.
Yes.
I mean, Perón and even Eva Perón were spies, weren't they, for the Nazis?
Well, they worked for the Nazis 100%. There's no doubt about that. But what we don't realize is that part of the reason was the industrial element. The raw materials in these countries were necessary to the Nazi war machine. Mexico had petroleum.
Yeah.
The Nazis needed the oil. Mexico was shipping oil to Nazi Germany. Until the Americans really pressured them to stop doing that, at which point the Mexicans would transship the oil to Panama, and then Panama would ship it to Nazi Germany. So you had, what I'm trying to say with this is that there were reasons for the Nazis to have economic connections and interests in many countries around the world, and that became more important as the war started to go against them. They started to expatriate technology, money, personnel all around the world, so they would not suffer the same humiliating defeat they had at the end of World War I. They wanted to make sure their industrial base was secure. So as early as 1943, the shipping started. By 1944, it was going in earnest. You were shipping gold abroad. I come across, I mentioned it in Ratline and I think in Hitler Legacy, that we just came across documents in the last couple of years that the Bank of Portugal shipped 40 tons of gold, of Nazi gold, to Macau, to their Portuguese colony in Asia, to Macau, of which 20 tons of it went to Indonesia, another 20 tons went into China. 20 tons of gold, and that's only one shipment that we know of.
Right. Wasn't there also some measures taken? I think I read somewhere that the Bush family got busted and fined for some collaboration.
Yes, that was the Trading with the Enemy Act. In 1942, they were identified as people who were still trading with the Nazis. They had no problem doing that. The government turned against them and shut them down, fined them, closed their company for a while. But that didn't stop the major situation from taking place, which was, for instance, AT&T, IT&T were both dealing with Nazi Germany during the war. IBM was dealing with Nazi Germany during the war. Standard Oil was really a German company. AEG, Telefunken, all of these companies had branches in the United States, had branches around the world. There was no way to stop the American involvement of the involvement of American industry and economic institutions with Nazi Germany. It was pervasive. It was everywhere.
Even as traitors, they got away with it.
Yes.
I also read that there was, prior to the war, there was a coup attempt that an American general whistle blew on, but nothing came out of it. They stopped it, of course, but no one was punished.
A coup attempt against Roosevelt?
Yeah, I think it was wealthy people in America. I think you wrote about this.
I did. This was a coup attempt against President Roosevelt. Yes.
Yeah.
They were planning it. They were training people to take over. They were doing all of this. It was generals who were extremely right-wing, who did not want Roosevelt to go to war with Germany. They felt that Roosevelt was Jewish, which evidently was one of their major problems with him. They thought he was a communist. They thought he was a dictator. I mean, I've read the material from that time criticizing Roosevelt in very harsh terms, and it's extremely reminiscent of how some of the similar information is being disseminated against President Obama. In Obama's case, he's a Muslim. He's not a Jew, according to these tirades. But he's also a dictator. He's a communist. He's all the rest of it. He's going to take America down. Yeah, the whole thing, And all of that was done against Roosevelt because the right did not want America to go to war against Germany. They wanted America to either stay out of it or actively support Nazi Germany. And Roosevelt had a very hard time with that. So they wanted to attempt a military coup or an assassination attempt. There was an assassination plotted in the United States, which was foiled. I mentioned that in Hitler Legacy also. And there was a coup attempt, of course, that was also foiled.
Who was these people?
Well, they were right-wing generals in the United States Army. They were right-wing industrialists as well. There was a rumor that Charles Lindbergh might have been involved. Charles Lindbergh, of course, was a major figure in the movement to keep out of the war against Nazi Germany. Who
disappeared, didn't he?
He pretty much disappeared, yeah. He, because of his position politically, once Pearl Harbor was attacked, his organization basically closed down. But until that time, he was very actively trying to get support in the United States to stay out of the war. He made a lot of speeches. We had a Catholic priest in Detroit, Father Coughlin, who was an outspoken critic of Roosevelt, an outspoken supporter of the Nazis. In his bookstore in Detroit at his church, you could get copies of Henry Ford's book on the Jews, the International Jew. You could also get copies of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, that famous hoax document that said the Jews were involved in a global conspiracy to destroy the world. So you had Catholic priests involved in this coup attempt. He was very much involved. You had a right-wing, crazy Russian, a white Russian living in Connecticut who was involved. You had all kinds of people who were involved in this thing. They really wanted to put an end to Roosevelt's presidency by any means necessary, and the idea was let's have a military coup, take over the country. You, General so-and-so, you'll take this area, you'll take that area. They were forming the plans to do it, to take over the country and put it under martial law, to keep Roosevelt from going to war against Germany. That's how strongly they felt about this.
And all thanks to one loyal general, they failed.
Yes.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of stuff here, the philosophical aspect, a little about the practical, but I want to go over to something that is also less known, namely Nazi ties to 3 different religions or factions. And I'm talking still in a timeline before the war. I mean, we could have a field day after the war, but even before the war, the Nazi ties to Catholicism, to early Islamism, and even to Zionism. Could you elaborate on these 3 phenomena?
Sure. I began researching the Catholic Nazi ties back a long time ago when I wrote Unholy Alliance, even before then. As a person who was born Catholic, I found it unbelievable that there should be a pope and cardinals and bishops protecting Nazi war criminals after the war. But this is so. We have to go back to the point where Vatican City became an independent country. And that was done because of an agreement with Mussolini. Mussolini, in exchange for Catholic support of fascism, declared that the Vatican would be their own separate country with their separate rules and passports and everything else. So there was a rapprochement between the fascists under Mussolini and the Pope. And then that became the concordat between the Pope then and Nazi Germany. So there was an agreement that, the Germans, the Nazis in particular, would not bother Catholics living in Germany, and the Pope would not say anything bad about Nazis and would not work against the Nazis. So that goes back to the 1930s, that particular type of relationship. But that is realpolitik, that is pragmatic maybe. People may have trouble with it. They may say, well, the Pope had to do it. But there's more to it than that. There were bishops and priests who were extremely pro-Nazi, who had pro-Nazi feelings, believed in the ideology 100%, hated communism, thought the Nazis were the best thing to defend European Christianity, against communism. So you had Bishop Alois Hudal, a very famous pro-Nazi who wrote about National Socialism in very favorable light. He was very prominent later after the war in helping war criminals escape to South America. You had the Catholic regime, for instance, in Croatia, the Ustashi. This was very pro-Nazi, very anti-Semitic. Not only anti-Semitic, they hated Serbians, they hated Serbian Orthodox, they hated everybody. Basically turned the whole country into a concentration camp.
Right.
So you had a lot of Catholic, and these were very pious Catholics. You have Archbishop Stepinac, who is set up to be canonized as a saint in the Catholic Church, who actually was very involved with the Ustashi and protecting Ustashi money, hiding their valuables in his church, and being actively involved in some of the excesses of the Ustashi regime against the Jews. So you have this tradition of Catholic prelates, especially the 1920s, 1930s, and through the 1940s, and after the war, of being pro-Nazi in sympathy and being pro-Nazi in activity, of actually helping them to escape. Part of this was the idea that the Nazis had that Jesus could not possibly have been Jewish. Okay, Jesus had to be an Aryan. Jesus was the illegitimate son of a Roman legionnaire, according to this story, right? So he was obviously an Aryan.
Right.
So you have the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus, right, idea. And this all comes from this belief. The Nazis were actually literally rewriting the Bible to remove all references to Judaism.
Wow.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Right? But that was their agenda. So they created their own church. They created a kind of German nationalist church as well, which was going to be very Christian and at the same time very anti-Semitic. I mean, it was just this fantasy land they were living in. And the contortions.
Didn't they have, wasn't one of the popes at that time a Nazi sympathizer?
Well, Pius XII, had Nazi sympathies. I mean, there's a lot of revisionist history these days. People are trying to say, well, the Pope did the best he could. The Pope was trying to save the Christians, the Catholics living in Germany from being persecuted, so he had to do what he had to do. But, I mean, if you really go back and look at all of the documentation, you're going to come away with a different point of view. Maybe Pius XII was not a real lover of the Nazis, but he hated communism more and was perfectly willing to work with the Nazis to stop the spread of communism. That's the deal that he made. And that mentality is what we here in the United States have to deal with constantly today. That's why we have red states and blue states, where we have a complete political division in this country. Goes back to World War II, goes back to the right-wing generals who wanted to assassinate Roosevelt and take over the country. It goes back to that mentality. If you're against communism, then you're a Nazi. If you're against Nazism, then you must be a communist. Those are the only two options available.
Always that communist ghost used to excuse Nazism.
Sure.
But is it true that the former Pope was in SS when he was young?
Oh, no. When you say former, you mean Benedict, I guess.
Yeah, Benedict.
Benedict was in the Hitler Youth when he was young. But
so he was that young. Okay.
He was very young. He was in Hitler Youth, and virtually everyone was in Hitler Youth.
Yeah.
And I can't really hold that against him. He was a German living in Germany.
Yeah.
I think he had no choice. So I'm not going to, although as much as I dislike Benedict, I'm not going to call him a Nazi yet. John Paul II, there was an idea he worked for I.G. Farben before he became a priest. I.G. Farben, of course, manufactured the Zyklon B crystals that were used to kill the Jews in the gas chambers. That's a very tenuous connection as well. But we know John Paul II's anti-communism was very strong. So, the jury is still out where that's concerned. Paul VI, however, the former Cardinal Montini, Secretary of State under Pius XII, was very responsible for helping Nazi war criminals to escape under something he called Caritas, charity, which was a kind of refugee organization that was set up to help refugees from the war, but which was used a lot to provide false documentation for Nazi war criminals seeking to get out of Europe and go to South America or the Middle East.
And this, people, is detailed much more in Peter's book, Ratline. It's such an important book, and it's very well written too. And we'll have to have you back just for a show on that, Peter, because it's so much material there, and it's so fascinating. But what about Zionism connections to Nazism?
Well, initially, Adolf Eichmann, the very famous Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, Eichmann actually studied Hebrew and Yiddish. And the idea was that he was going to go to the Middle East and try to cut some deal with the Zionist community there to take all the Jews out of Germany. He didn't want any Jews in Germany. The final solution was get rid of the Jews in Germany by any means necessary. And one of these means was possibly arranging with Zionists to take the Jews off his hands. Menachem Begin, who later became a very important commando and then later Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin worked directly with the Nazis at some point in order to see if they could cut a deal whereby they could take the Jews out of Germany and move them to the Middle East. The problem with that arrangement was that there was a very vocal opponent to this, which was the Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a very famous leader of the Palestinian liberation movement, who did not want any Jews, of course, any extra Jews in the Middle East. He wanted them all killed. So he went to Berlin and put his story through that he wanted to make sure that the Nazis would not be sending any more Jews to the Middle East. They had their hands full as it was, and they were trying to get rid of as many as possible. And he would work with Hitler to eradicate the Jews in North Africa and the Middle East. He would cooperate fully in that regard. He was the Grand Mufti. He was the spiritual leader of Palestine through a series of Byzantine political machinations, but he became very prominent. He fought for the Ottoman Turks, for the Ottoman Empire in World War I. And then later, when he saw that the British had decided to keep the Middle East carved up between themselves and the French, basically betrayed the Arab revolt, as well as, of course, defeated Ottoman Turkey. He became politicized, disillusioned, completely.
With the West.
And turned into hatred. He believed that there was a global Jewish conspiracy against the world, and that he was witnessing it every day in the British Mandate of Palestine. And it was a hard argument to refute because you had suddenly an influx of Jews coming into Palestine. These were Europeans. You had the British working with Zionist organizations in Europe to carve up the Middle East, according to his perception. So he could make a very good case that there was a worldwide Jewish conspiracy and that it was taking place in Palestine and that Muslims were going to be affected by it. They were being disenfranchised.
So the Zionist corporation, I read that many rich and leading Jews were saved because of some kind of rat line for them, whereas the poor and the so-called ghetto Jews were the ones ending up in concentration camps. Is this?
Sure. Like in every circumstance like this, especially in wartime, you have tremendous corruption. So if you have a wealthy Jew or a wealthy anyone who can pay their way out of going to the camps and bribe an officer somewhere, it was going to happen. In the same rat lines that were being used to move Nazi war criminals out of the reach of the Allies were also being used to move Jewish people into Palestine, into Israel, sometimes in the same building. Wow. There were hotels, there were guest houses in the Tyrol on the border between Italy and Austria. That was the major place where Nazi war criminals would flee, the area around Bolzano, and this was the major locus of all the false paperwork, the false documentation for everyone. So you had Nazi war criminals in the same guest houses as Jews who were fleeing the same situation. They were going to Palestine, and the Nazis were going to South America, and they would be in the same room. They would be. Yeah,
but this explain why Zionism has been so dominating in Israel, because if many of the Jews who got out of the sinking ship that was Europe was Zionists because they wanted to exit, yes, we can pay, sure.
Right, sure.
And the rest into the camps.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It does make sense.
And poor people who ended up in the camps, they would be moderate and normal people, so to speak.
Or they would be religious Jews. They'd be believing Jews. They would be people easily identified, as Jews by the Nazis. Whereas
because the Zionists were more ideology, wasn't they? Yeah, less religious in the beginning.
Yeah.
But what about Islam? I know that Islamism, fundamentalism, was set up by the British, but then, especially after the war, hijacked by the Nazis. Wasn't there some kind of respect or cooperation between, like the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, and Nazism?
Well, there was to a certain extent. Hitler himself, especially in the beginning, had no time for Muslims. As far as he was concerned, he equated Muslims with Arabs, and Arabs were Semites, and they were all useless to him. But as the war progressed and he needed as many allies as possible, Himmler persuaded him to work with the Muslims because, number one, the Muslims were not a quote-unquote slave religion. There was a religion of warriors, and that appealed to Himmler and eventually appealed to Hitler as well. These were people who had fought the Jews and defeated them, in their area, got rid of the Jews mostly in the Middle East. So that appealed also to Himmler and to Hitler's idea of an ally. I think the handwriting was eventually be on the wall, and they would have turned against them eventually. But at least during the time of the war, it was useful to make this kind of an alliance. The Germans have always had, since the World War I, before the war, they had this fascination with the Middle East and with Islam. And there was a very famous amateur archaeologist called Max von Oppenheim who spent a lot of time in that part of the world. He lived in Egypt. He seemed to have converted to Islam. We're not quite sure of the details. But he was an advisor to Kaiser Wilhelm. And he advised the Kaiser when World War I was about to take place, about to start. He advised the Kaiser to talk to the Sultan of the Ottoman Turks and convince the Sultan to declare a global jihad. Wow. Against all the enemies of Islam. This was the first instance in Islamic history of a global war against the infidel, and it was instigated by Germans. So there you go.
Yeah, and I know Sebotendorf too was fascinated by mystical Islam, Sufism.
Yes.
So there was links there. The Germans who were interested in Middle East, wasn't it for archaeological and antediluvian purposes?
Sure, there was a lot of that interest. I mean, we can talk about T.E. Lawrence, for instance, in the days before World War I. Lawrence was always at one dig, and there were, the Germans were at another dig, and there was always this competition. And it appeared as though the Germans were looking for whatever they could find. I mean, Schliemann, discovered Troy,
Yeah.
and this was a major boost to the idea of archaeology, is that maybe all these mythologies were true. And let's go and find these antediluvian societies that people claimed existed, that there was, before the flood, there were these vast cities in Iraq and in Egypt and in Africa and places like that. So you had this a lot of motivation to find these things, and the German archaeologists were very motivated by this. Max von Oppenheim was an archaeologist, but he was also involved in mysticism. He was involved in, Islamic religion and very strange North African practices. He traveled amongst the Berbers in North Africa and all of that. He was, like a lot of Germans, fascinated by that part of the world, and it was close enough, to Germany to reach, pretty easily, and it was kind of a playground for these guys,
Mm-hmm.
So Islam in those days was not what we have been trained to think of Islam today. In the West, we're trained to think of Islam in a certain way, and that's unfortunate, because there's really no reality between the way Islam is being presented.
No, but we need a ghost after Soviet collapsed.
Sure.
We need
Yes.
some bad guy to blame on. So yeah,
We have it in Islam, and that's the problem with that, is that there are 1 billion Muslims in the world, and we're pissing every one of them off. So that's not really a healthy attitude to take. But I've lived among Muslims for a long time. I lived in Malaysia for 7 years in a Muslim country. I've lived and traveled a lot in Indonesia and places like that. So I know that the picture we present about Islam is totally at variance with what the reality is. But at any rate, you had groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. You had nationalist groups that arose in reaction to the fact that by we I mean the British and the French, betrayed the Arab revolt. The Arabs thought they were getting their independence. They ignored the call to jihad coming out of Constantinople, coming out of Istanbul. They ignored this completely. They fought against the Turks because they thought they were going to have liberation, and in the end they did not.
because that's what they got in Europe, Bulgaria, Greece, all these countries who had been under the Ottoman Empire. They got their independence, but
Sure.
the Arabs, they were double betrayed.
Yes. They were betrayed upon betrayal, and because of oil, and because of access to the Suez Canal, all of these geopolitical considerations, they were betrayed. They were completely. There's no way around that particular part of history. We have to admit that's what happened, and that's why there was this growth of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's why there was the growth of so many organizations. The hatred of the West was a minority position among a lot of very pious Muslims who saw in the West, decadence and degradation and, all this other stuff. But then it became a battle cry once they had been betrayed. And then there was the scapegoating. Well, the West is decadent, and it's irreligious, and it's anti-spiritual, it's very materialistic, and now they've betrayed us. So there's something wrong with the West entirely. There's something wrong with their culture, their religion, their economics, everything. We reject all of it, and that's what's happened. That's what we're dealing with today. And if that betrayal had not taken place, I think history would have been quite different. If the Arabs had their independence and we walked away, and let the thing play out the way it should have played out, I think history would be quite different.
And I also think it wouldn't have been so much friction also between Israel, the Jews, and the Muslims, because they have lived there for thousands of years together.
Prince Faisal, the man who was portrayed by Alec Guinness in the movie Lawrence of Arabia, Prince Faisal had no problem with allowing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. He said it in writing. He said it to the British, as long as he was still the king. I mean, he was the Hashemite king of Mecca and Medina. He was the guy in charge of the holy places, which included the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So he said, as long as I'm still the king, we can give out a whole bunch of land in Palestine, for the Jews. I have no problem with this. He said that. But then he got betrayed. He was not allowed to remain king. He was kicked out. Ibn Saud was put in his position.
Oh yeah, the corrupt families.
Corrupt family, the Wahhabi, the very fanatic religious family as well. And that's why we call that country Saudi Arabia today. It's because it's named after his family, Ibn Saud. So now we've made so many mistakes, one after the other, and we betrayed our promises constantly.
And build up fanatical strains such as Wahhabism and Salafism. It's crazy.
It's crazy.
And it's a part of the post-war analysis, I think, because it directly links to where we are today.
Yep.
But we've been on quite a fascinating journey today, Peter. We've been all over the place, but we've been very disciplined in keeping within the timeline until
more or less, yes.
End of the war, yes. Mm-hmm. And so when we get you back, we will have to zoom in on these extremely fascinating post-war phenomena connected to everything we talked about. But before we close today, I want to wrap up some notes I did during your elaborations that were a little unclear, so maybe you could just clear them up. First, you mentioned that Hitler back in the day got connected especially through Eckhart. Did he meet Anton Drexel, the founder of what became the National Socialist Arbeiterparti? Did he meet him through Eckhart?
No. He met Drexel directly when he was sent to spy on the German Workers' Party.
Right.
Now, Drexel was already there. Hitler became a member of the party and then eventually took it over. Drexel was a locksmith. He was the guy who was one of the organizers of the early German Workers' Party.
I see. And you mentioned also that the meeting between, I think it was Lebensfeld and Hitler was mentioned in a biography, but it was unclear if you meant Hitler's biography, Mein Kampf.
No. It was in Lanz von Liebenfeld's own statements.
Right. Okay.
Yep.
I'm with you. Couple of more points. I know that Gestapo Mueller, on the order of, I think it was on behalf of Mr. Bormann, researched potential Jewish blood in Hitler's heritage. Mm-hmm. Now, it's rumored that he found that, I think it was Hitler's aunt or some relative, worked for the Rothschilds. Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, there were a lot of connections that way between Hitler and having Jewish relatives. And of course, having family that worked for the Jews and for the Rothschilds in particular, that particular case, yes. But a lot of this was suppressed. Gestapo Mueller was doing this because, for two reasons. One, he wanted some leverage, just in case he needed it against Hitler for blackmail purposes, but also so that Hitler would know in advance where the problems were. I think we didn't mention the fact that when Hitler came to power finally, he made sure that people who had knowledge of his life, especially his private life, before he became Chancellor of Germany, were picked up and killed. One of them was Hanussen, who was a very famous psychic in Berlin society, who taught Hitler how to speak, what gestures to make, how to captivate an audience. Hanussen was very instrumental in convincing Hitler when everything seemed like it was over for him and for the Nazi Party in 1932. It was Hanussen who said, "Don't worry about it. You perform a ritual in your place of birth. You pull out at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve a mandrake root from a cemetery, and I assure you your future will be secure, and by the end of January you'll be Chancellor of Germany." He told this to Hitler when there seemed no possibility that Hitler would survive politically. Hanussen actually went and did this ritual, came back, and Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on precisely the day that Hanussen had predicted he would. Hanussen, when Hitler became Chancellor, was taken out and shot to cover up that story.
But Hanussen must be said to be maybe Hitler's real spiritual father then.
Possibly. I mean, he taught Hitler a lot of things. Hitler was fascinated with Hanussen. By having Hanussen around him, Hitler didn't need to join any secret societies or cults. He had somebody with a direct link, a direct contact, somebody who could entertain him and at the same time predict things and make things happen. But there was also a Catholic priest, his name was Stempfel, who had a lot of blackmail information on Hitler, particularly involving Hitler's niece, who committed suicide.
Yeah.
Hitler was famously in love with this niece. I think her name was Angela Raubel, if I'm not mistaken. And something was fishy between him and Angela, and there was, we don't really know the whole story, but at any rate, eventually she committed suicide in her apartment, an apartment paid for by Hitler.
You don't subscribe to the hypothesis that he killed her or got her killed? Because she threatened to reveal his Jewish heritage or their affair or something like that?
Yeah, it's possible. Hitler was obviously racked with guilt over her death.
Okay.
I mean, he memorialized it every year since she was dead. He kept that apartment pristine. No one was allowed to rent it or to live in it.
Yeah, that's right.
While he was alive. So it was like a mausoleum. It was a shrine, basically, to her. So whatever happened, whether he killed her or she killed herself, that information was held. There were some letters, there was some documentation that was held by this particular priest, and he, of course, was taken out and murdered as well the same night. This was the sort of the night of the long knives, when Hitler settled all of his scores and killed everybody who was in opposition to him.
Even SA.
Even SA. Yeah, even the head of the SA, Ernst Röhm.
Yeah.
All of these people were murdered, taken out into the woods and shot, or however they were killed, So there was a lot of blackmail potential there. Gestapo Mueller was probably looking into the same ideas, the same material, and some of it made its way to the National Archives. So not a lot of it, but scraps of it did make its way to the German records, the archive in the Library of Congress, where I came across it.
The last question, Peter. Why on earth did Hess, whom many regard as, everything is relative, we're talking about Nazis after all, but they regard him as maybe more peaceful. I don't know if that image is deserved, but why would he, in 1940, be so suicidal that he went to England? And, I guess his fate we should get back to in a post-war episode, but just why did he go there?
Well, in the first place, Haushofer told him it was a great astrological time for him to try to form an alliance between Nazi Germany and England. And the person he went to see was a known Nazi sympathizer, a member of the House of Lords who was a Nazi sympathizer. So he was flying deliberately to meet him and to see if he could...
But did he get guarantees that he wouldn't be captured?
No, well, this is what's fishy about this story. He's making this flight to England right around the time that Operation Barbarossa, which is the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazis and the breaking of the Stalin Pact, was being put into motion. So for some reason, Hess flies to England. Was it a diversion? Was there something else behind Hess's flight? It's always been kind of a mystery because it doesn't make a lot of sense. Hess went there. He went there to talk to the politicians in England to try to form a peace treaty. I mean, that's the cover story anyway that we have. And nobody talks to him. What happened? Winston Churchill refused to talk to him. Winston Churchill refused to the second most important man in Germany, Hitler's right-hand man, who flies into his country under cover of darkness, parachutes out and says, "Take me to your leader," basically. And Winston Churchill says, literally, his words were, I'm not going to deal with Hess. I want to watch the Marx Brothers. Where
would the world of quotes be if it wasn't for Churchill?
If it wasn't for Churchill. So he has the projector set up. He's watching the Marx Brothers. He doesn't want to hear about Hess. What does that mean? What was really going on? There's something else going on. Yeah. And, of course, the post-war aspect of this is important as well. But when Hess was in captivity during the war, there was a rumor this wasn't really Hess. And the head of British intelligence and the head of American intelligence, Wild Bill Donovan at the time, all of these guys wondered whether or not, the Hess in captivity was really Hess. They were looking for scars. They were looking for certain things that would tell whether or not this guy was who he said he was. There was an idea that this was an imposter for some reason, and they kept an imposter.
Not a double.
A double.
Just an imposter.
No, well, a double. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Or an imposter. I mean, but basically a double. Hess's double. But then, if that's so, then what happened to the real Hess, which we haven't seen? So I don't know. There was a lot of mystification about the flight of Hess. There was a lot more to it, and we'll never know.
How did they capture him? Where did they capture him?
He flew. I mean, he was off slightly where his landing was concerned. His plane kind of crash landed. He got out of the plane, and a couple of farmers found him, and they brought him to the local constabulary, and that was the end of it.
It doesn't sound like a very professional diplomatic mission to me.
No, it was a very ignominious end to that diplomatic mission, yes.
I'm just taking this right out of the air, but is there any traces that Bormann could have been involved to outsmart him or fool him somehow to get in a better position himself?
Well, Bormann was known for that. Bormann was a real political animal, and whoever was between him and Hitler, he had to get rid of one way or the other. And that meant Himmler, that meant Ernst Kaltenbrunner, that meant von Ribbentrop. Everybody, had to get out of the way between himself and Hitler. So that's a possibility too. But there's another possibility, which, as I mentioned in Unholy Alliance, is the Nuremberg trial. At the Nuremberg trial, Hess gets up to make a speech, and he starts to talk about mind control. In this speech.
Wow.
They cut him off immediately. They don't allow him to talk anymore. After only a couple of minutes of talking, they cut him off, and they say, that's it, enough for you, forget it, no more. It's a tantalizing introduction. If you read his Nuremberg speech, it's very short because they didn't let him talk. But he's starting to talk about mind control and how, things are not what they seem, and then he's cut off, and that's the end of it.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
And you are known, actually, for having written books on mind control and stuff, like your series...
Sinister Forces.
Sinister Forces.
Yes.
So, but today we've been covering stuff, especially from your book Unholy Alliance, A History of Nazi Involvement with the Occult, which I guess is your first book on this topic. Really a good read, people, especially if you're into the more esoteric aspects of this. Now, next time we have Peter on, we'll go more into aspects that's partly covered in this book, but also his next book called Ratline, Soviet Spies, Nazi Priests, and the Disappearance of Adolf Hitler. And, as I'm sure you got by now, Peter is a fact-based researcher. So, even if, the notion that Hitler didn't commit suicide in a bunker is news to you, I recommend you reserve judgment till you hear the evidence. And the third book, of course, being The Hitler Legacy, that you alluded to in this interview too. The Nazi cult in diaspora, how it was organized, how it was funded, and why it remains a threat to global security in the age of terrorism. And I believe this is a very important topic to cover. So, thank you a lot for coming on and sharing with us everything that you know.
My pleasure.
So fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, that concludes the forum for today. Tune in again in the future, folks, when we're having Peter back to elaborate on the even more fascinating, yet disturbing, continuation of this subject, as part of our series on uncovering an hitherto less known aspect of our global history, where we learn much more about the dealings and movements of these dark players on the world scene. Finally, let me remind you that if you enjoy our programs, we could need a helping hand with covering costs to keep the forum going. Until next time, I remain your sincere host Al, together with Bella, the technician, and Mr. Mo, the webmaster. Be seeing you.
Who is number one?